Last week, we began a series from the book of Daniel. We're going to look at three stories that are often told as children's stories, but they're not for children. They have truth in them that we as adults really need to hear. The first story we looked at last week was the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Last week, I mentioned that I contend that the greatest part of that story and the greatest example of faith in that story is not when they walk out of the furnace unscathed, but the greatest example of faith in the story is when they look a tyrant in the eye and say, our God is able to save us from you, but even if God doesn't, I will never bow down to you, I will never serve you, I will never worship your gods. That is the highlight of the story. And this morning, we're going to look at another story from the book of Daniel. This one actually includes Daniel and a different tyrant this time. And I'm going to do like I did last week, where I'm going to tell you part of the story and I'll read part of the story. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had passed off the scene, and now his son Belshazzar was the king and the ruler over all of Syria. And Babylon was the capital. So this story begins a lot like the book of Esther. It begins with a big party. And Belshazzar has thrown this great party, and everybody's having a good time, and everybody's in the mood to celebrate. Years earlier, Nebuchadnezzar subdued the city of Jerusalem, and we talked about that, how he brought back captives to Babylon. But while he was there, he went into the temple, and he raided it and took everything of value out of the temple. So he took these gold and silver cups and utensils and all these things that were used in sacred rituals for the Jewish people. I mean, these were sacred things that he stole out of the temple and brought back to Babylon, and he locked them up in a safe. Well, as this party wore on, Belshazzar had a little too much to drink, and the wine took the edge off his good judgment. And he had somebody go to the safe and open it up and bring out all of those gold and silver cups and utensils that had been a part of the temple. And they brought them out and they filled them with wine, and he and his guests and their wives and their concubines and everybody just drank from them and laughed and were just having a good time. These are sacred cups and things that were used in the temple for religious rituals. It would be like someone stealing our communion cups and then playing some game drinking shots out of them, So not only were they, just being sacrilegious and defiling these sacred vessels, but while they were doing it, they were praising the gods of the Assyrians, the gods of gold and silver and wood and stone, and making fun of the God of Israel, whom they felt like they had defeated, and that their God was much stronger, obviously, in their mind. And in the midst of this revelry, something really weird happened. A disembodied hand just appeared in the air and started writing with his finger on the wall. And we get the impression that it starts to write right above Belshazzar's head. And he's looking up, and there's this hand, and it's just writing on the wall above his head. And let me read this to you. This is in the book of Daniel, chapter 5, beginning in verse 5. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened. His legs became weak. His knees were knocking. This hand appears and starts to write on the wall, and it reminds us of how the hand of God actually wrote the first set of the Ten Commandments that were given to Moses. And then, when we find ourselves in a difficult situation, we often say, well, we're in God's hand. Well, it's a reminder to Belshazzar that he's in God's hand and that he's subject to the hand of God. Everyone is, even tyrants. And Belshazzar turned white as a sheet. His knees started to knock. And it says, I find it really interesting that the NIV translates the middle part of this verse as, his legs became weak. And the Aramaic text, and this part of Daniel is actually written in Aramaic, not Hebrew, but the Aramaic text literally reads, the joints of his loins loosened. Now, I don't mean to be crude, but you can interpret this verse as saying that Belshazzar turned white as a sheet and had to go change his robe. And I'm glad you laughed, because the first readers of the book of Daniel, when they read that, they laughed. They laughed out loud because they thought that was funny. Because thinking about this dictator, who did whatever he wanted to do, scared to death because now he's having to face God. They laughed. It brought them hope. It brought them joy. It brought them encouragement. Because the people who first read the book of Daniel were living under a different tyrant. I mentioned him last week. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes. And he also did some terrible things. He also desecrated the temple, maybe even worse than Belshazzar. When Antiochus Epiphanes took over Jerusalem, he went to the temple, and you know how Jewish people are not allowed to eat pork or to have anything to do with a pig. Pigs were unclean, and they wouldn't even touch a pig. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes barbecued pigs on the holy altar where they brought their sacrifices in the temple, just to desecrate it, just to rub it in their face. So you can only imagine how incredibly painful and terrible that was for them to see that. And so they read this story and they start to imagine how maybe one day, instead of Belshazzar, it'll be Antiochus Epiphanes, whose knees are going to grow weak and who's going to turn white as a sheet, because one day he was going to have to face God for what he had done. It reminded them there is a day of judgment. And whether in this life or the next, tyrants and their followers will answer for what they've done. And so the king called in his advisors, all of his wise men, all of his counselors, and nobody could read what was on the wall. And they all took a shot. Nobody could read it. Not even the pharmacist could read it. And this part of the story made me feel better, because apparently no one can read God's handwriting either. And then this happens next, down in verse 10. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners." So the queen heard all this commotion, and she came into the room to see what was going on, and she saw Belshazzar, pale as could be, and he was wearing different clothes, and she saw the writing on the wall and realized nobody there could read it or understand what it meant. Now, when we see the title queen, we automatically think that, it was his wife or consort. But most scholars believe, and I agree, that it was not his wife, it was his mother. It was the queen mother, not the queen wife. And then this conversation makes perfect sense, because this really sounds like a mother talking to her son. She says, "Listen, your father, rest his soul, when he got in a spot like this, he had a guy." And you can just hear her telling him, "Now your father, let me tell you what your father would have done if this were him. He would call Daniel." And so he learns about Daniel, and so he brings Daniel out. And after some introductions, Daniel's getting ready to, he offers Daniel all these rewards, but Daniel's not interested. Daniel told him that he and God were pretty close. He could read God's handwriting. Now, once again, the first readers of the book of Daniel, they're laughing at this point. Because here's Belshazzar, thinks he's the supreme ruler of everything, white as a sheet, knees knocking, holding mommy's hand for advice to know what to do next. They think this is hilarious. They're laughing as they read this. But before Daniel interpreted this handwriting, he thought this was a good opportunity. He had a captive audience to explain a few things to Belshazzar about being in power and about God. He pretty much had a 3-point sermon for the king and everyone else, and it went kind of like this. First point, Belshazzar apparently had not learned anything from the past. He had not learned a thing about punishment and about grace that God had shown his father Nebuchadnezzar. Now, there's a whole section that we skipped between last week and this week. And in that section, Nebuchadnezzar, after the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fiery furnace, and he said, their God must be the God of everything, It didn't take him long to forget all that. And he went right back to being his old self, full of pride, doing whatever he wanted to do, not caring about anybody else. And so he had a dream, and Daniel came to interpret the dream, and the dream basically was, and then this happened, that because of his pride and the way he treated people, he was going to go insane for a few years. And he would actually live outside among the animals. And then he is going to get his sanity back. And that's exactly what happened. The losing it was God's punishment. The getting it back was God's grace. And Belshazzar had seen, he had witnessed all of this, but he hadn't learned a thing. He just kept thinking he could do whatever he wanted to do, unconcerned as his father had been. The second point, Belshazzar thought he was above the law, even God's laws. He could desecrate vessels from the holy temple and not have to answer to God or anyone else. And then the third point, he brought out the worst in others. It wasn't enough that he desecrated the vessels from the temple. He encouraged everybody else to do it. And so others joined him. And while they were drinking from them, they praised the idols made of gold and silver and bronze and wood and stone. And so Daniel said to him, in other words, Belshazzar, you've been running around acting like you're the ruler of the universe and you don't have to answer to anyone. You've crossed the line. And God has ran out of patience with you. And then we read these verses. This is the inscription that was written. Many, many tekel parson. And here's what these words mean. Many. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Well, the good news for Belshazzar is he didn't have to wait long before the judgment came. Because listen to verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. That very night, before the party was over, he was assassinated, and the great kingdom of the Assyrians fell. And it was the beginning of the rule of the Medes and the Persians. If you know your history, you know all that. But here's a really interesting note. The ruler who had him killed and took over the kingdom was a man named Darius. And the sages calculate that the day of Darius's birth was the same day that Nebuchadnezzar entered and violated the sanctity of the temple. Thus, the individual who would bring about the subjugation of the Babylonian kingdom came to life on the same day Israel's temple was destroyed and violated. 62 years earlier. So on the day the Babylonians invaded the temple and defiled the temple, on that very day, in another country, a child named Darius was born. And after they had invaded the temple, the Jewish people were praying for God to show vengeance, for God to give them justice. And it didn't happen immediately. But a baby was born, and justice was coming. Our world is not what God created it to be. But remember, a baby has been born. And we're going to celebrate the birth of that baby next month. The kingdom of God is on its way. And there is nothing, no tyrant that can stop it. And I can't believe we've turned these stories into children's stories and we've ignored their meaning for so long. I remember when my children were little, we had a video of these stories of Daniel, and they would watch them over and over. They loved watching these stories of Daniel. And I remember at the end of this particular story, I would always remind them, remember kids, only God is allowed to write on the wall. As an adult, I walk away from this story with two gifts that I think God gives us when we face tyrants. Now, the tyrants that Daniel and the first readers of this book faced were political tyrants. And through the years, Christians have had to deal with political tyrants. They come and they go. They always have. But these gifts work in the face of any kind of tyranny. It could be a political tyrant, or it could be the tyrant of disease and injury that oppresses you physically. It could be the tyranny of a boss or a workplace that leaves you unfulfilled and drained. It could be the tyranny of an uncertain future that leaves you feeling hopeless. We face all kinds of tyrants. But here are the gifts that God gives us to face them. The first gift is hope. And we've talked about it before, but this runs throughout the book of Daniel. There is hope that God will have the last word. That God will have the last say. The tyrant doesn't win in the end. God does. Two farmers were looking at the field of a third farmer who was known to be just a despicable person. And one of the farmers said to the other, "Look at his crops. He lies, he cheats, he steals, he takes advantage of people. His crops are growing like crazy. All I can do to keep mine alive. If God is a God of justice, why does God let this happen?" And the other farmer said, "God is a God of justice, and justice will come. God just didn't say it would come this season." God has the last word against whatever tyrant you're facing. The other gift is humor. And I tried to point this out as I'm telling the story. The people who were reading this story, they were laughing as they read it out loud. It's hard to be afraid of something you can laugh at. And so Belshazzar is this frightening picture of a ruler who could have people killed at his whim. But as they read the story, he is pale as a sheet, knees literally knocking together, scared to death, holding his mommy's hand. It's hard to fear what you can laugh at. Seeing humor in difficult circumstances helps get you through them. I had a good friend in high school who was born deaf. And there's nothing funny about being deaf. It was hard for him in school sometimes because he had to get help from others with the schoolwork because he couldn't hear the teacher's lecture. He could read lips really well, but if you didn't know sign language, it was sometimes hard for him to communicate with you. And yet he handled it with a great sense of humor. He went to a school for the deaf until he got into high school, and he was a great athlete. He wanted to come to my high school and play football there because his father had played football at my high school, and that was important to him. So he transferred to my high school. And so I was the first one on the football team to learn sign language. And so I got paired up with him for all the drills throughout August, all the drills, training stuff you would do. We did them all together. And when we do blocking and tackling drills, and then the coach blows the whistle and you stop. Well, we would be doing these drills. He'd blow the whistle, I would stop. Derek would knock me to the ground. Then he would look at the coach with this like confused look on his face. And the coach would point to the whistle and he'd go, oh, oh. And then he would look at me and he would smile. And I knew. He knew the play was over. He just knocked me to the ground for the fun of it. And when I would go pick him up, we were going to go places. I'd go pick him up in my car. He'd get in the car. First thing he would do is change the channel on the radio. And then he would sign to me. He didn't like that station. He was always messing with people, all the time. He had a great sense of humor. Nobody ever laughed at him, but we all laughed with him because he took something like deafness and he didn't fear it. He made fun of it. Humor gives us great strength when we're facing difficult things. Tyrants come and go, but God is with us when we face them. All kinds. And God gives us these gifts among others. God gives us hope because God will have the last say. And God gives us the gift of humor because it's hard to be afraid of something you laugh at. These are great gifts. So make the best use of them because these are the gifts God gives us in our lives. Amen.